In the recent past, we've seen several, I'll call them spates, of media coverage on the need to increase regulation of big tech. The most recent one was social media-driven frenzy amongst Trump supporters that drove them, if you will, to breach the Capitol building security. But less recent examples include scalpers on Amazon profiting from fears about the coronavirus and driving up prices of masks to unreasonable levels. I can't even begin to get into the argument about whether we need increased regulation on big tech or not, although I think most of us would agree that big tech is right now subject to, on average, less regulation than historical brick and mortar businesses have been subject to. What I will do, though, is I want to talk about sort of what do we mean by regulating big tech? Because there's not just sort of one aspect to it. There's actually multiple issues. And so I'm going to try to lay the groundwork out so that when you hear somebody talking about regulating big tech, you can put it in context and you also have some sort of feel for what the pros and cons and what the potential costs of doing so will be. Now, basically, regulating big tech can fall into four different sets of arguments, if you will. Those based upon safety, privacy, competition, or honesty. And we'll cover each of them in a little bit more detail. First of all, safety. There's actually two aspects to the issue of safety. First is the aspect of product development. Most big tech apps, software, technologies, if you will, are shipped in a version called a minimally viable product. The idea is that they'll ship in, quote, beta, which is software that's still being tested, and they'll learn from that, they'll refine it, and eventually it will get to be a more finished product. The problem, though, is that this leaves the consumer, the end user of that type of software or that type of application, as the one doing the beta testing and the one that basically is going to be victim, if you will, to problems with quality control. Now, this has been an issue for a while, but it didn't used to matter as much as it does now. Back in the early part of the 2000s, Google's Gmail, for example, was in beta for over 5 years. I forget how long Mozilla's Firefox browser was in beta before it actually came out as, quote, a finished or somewhat finished product. So we've seen this issue before. But now that we're seeing the technology coming from big tech sort of having a more direct impact on the physical world through things like artificial intelligence and so forth, it starts to matter more whether you're putting out a minimally viable product or one that's been thoroughly tested. And so when you hear people talking about, well, we need safety, one aspect of safety is testing before the product is released. Another aspect has to deal with the business model that many of these big tech firms follow. Many of the big tech firms monetize primarily through advertisements. And if you want to increase advertisements, you have contentious type information on your site. There's been lots of studies that show harmful content like hate speech, disinformation, and so forth will drive more people to come and view / argue / discuss the concepts than less contentious information will. So the whole business model for some of these big tech companies is set up around sort of fomenting discontent or fomenting disagreement, if you will. And I guess an example of that is the social media coverage around the 2020 election and the subsequent swearing in of President Biden. Now, the second sort of facet, if you will, of regulating big tech deals with privacy. We've really seen an uptick in media's and everybody's concern about this since a story broke in 2018 that Cambridge Analytica, which is a UK consulting firm, had been sort of harvesting personal data using an app on Facebook back in 2013, and they got information on potentially more than 87 million users, which they could then turn around and use to predict things like what issues mattered to the users, how they were going to vote on certain issues, and so forth. And they provided analytic information out of that data to the 2016 presidential campaigns of both Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. Now, there have been some recent attempts to regulate such uses, trying to curb big tech firms' releasing of personal data to third parties. Europe's GDPR and California's CCPA regulations come to mind right away. The problem with those, though, is that they place the burden on consumers to, quote, opt out of data usage when they sign their agreement, if you will, with the social media company or with the Amazon or whoever it is that they're dealing with. And that places the burden on the relatively uninformed consumer to decide, I don't want to allow my data to be used. Many consumer advocates propose that we should have an opt-in form instead. That is, you have to get the consumers to say, yes, you may use it, rather than, no, you may not use it. The third facet of big tech regulation deals with regulation for competitive reasons. We've all seen examples where big tech can exploit the scale and their network effects to basically curb competition. I'll use myself as a case in point. I'm both a consumer through the Amazon website, but I'm also a supplier to Amazon in that I self-publish a couple of textbooks through Amazon. What I've seen sort of from both sides of the story is that I can't always find all products on Amazon. There's a bias towards both Amazon products and third parties that Amazon sort of supports, in my opinion. But from a supplier point of view, we don't really have any control, for instance, on what portion of the book selling price that Amazon takes, or how much they charge for printing the raw material, printing the book. So we find ourselves either on either end, either as consumers or as suppliers, going through a central party, Amazon, that has a lot of power over our activities and can dictate what we see and what we're going to have to pay if we're selling on Amazon. Now, historically, the way such monopolies have been addressed is through some type of antitrust legislation. Not necessarily to break them up, and nobody, I think, really seems to believe that breaking up Facebook or breaking up YouTube or breaking up Amazon into multiple entities won't further sort of muddy the waters. But there are sort of intermediate steps that could be taken. First of all, there's ways to force platforms to choose between operating a marketplace and participating in that marketplace. There's ways to encourage online retailers to end anti-competitive behavior towards suppliers, advertisers, and users. And then lastly, we have regulation for honesty. And this isn't the way that you probably think of it, right? You probably think, well, yes, they're putting wrong information on their website. That's not what we mean. We're talking primarily about sort of this whole idea of marketers advertising through either the platform for a big tech company or through the network to other internet sites that those big tech companies participate in. The issue is that, unlike conventional advertisement media, big tech companies don't usually allow marketers and ad agencies to audit the numbers that they report in terms of the number of views, the number of clicks, and so forth. And because of that, that means that nobody can really verify, if I run an ad on Facebook, for example, how many people have seen my ad. Facebook purports to tell me what it is, but there's no way for me to independently verify that. And if you remember, back when most of us were familiar with TV advertising, right? There with the Nielsen ratings and so forth, independent ways to assess how many people had watched a TV show, and therefore, presumably, the advertisements that ran during the TV show. There's really nothing like that for big tech. And a lot of the marketers that push ads through big tech companies feel that the statistics that are reported back to them in terms of the number of user counts or the number of clicks or the number of advertisement views are being overstated. If they're being overstated, then that means that the same thing must be true of revenues that those big tech firms are earning from advertisements. So because of that, there is a set of security laws that say if you are knowingly overstating your revenues year after year, you're subject to prosecution. So there is a mechanism in place to deal with this, but nobody's actually really gone this step the way they potentially could. Now, there's going to be a cost to regulating big tech. First of all, there's going to be an explicit cost, because anytime we talk about a government entity or a industry organization having oversight on some processes or regulation on those processes, we're talking about additional cost, overhead. You'll have a new bureau to monitor, you name it, in the context of what we just talked about. But in addition to those explicit costs of hiring entities to monitor and regulate big tech, we're also going to have some implicit cost. Let's deal with them one at a time. So if we talk about safety regulation, right, the first part where they're putting out that minimally viable application or whatever, if we keep them from doing that, that means those of us that would like to use beta software won't get the chance to. It means that some software that would benefit from going through beta might have a bigger chance of actually being published out to the consumers, might never be published to start with. So it's going to have a constraining effect on the number and types and how quickly apps can be sort of put to the marketplace. The second type of safety regulation that we talked about basically would impose limitations on the freedom of speech. Now, I'm not saying that they shouldn't do that, but once you start dictating what can be allowed on Facebook, on YouTube, and so forth, even further beyond the level that we're already imposing such restrictions, or the firms are imposing such restrictions on themselves, you're talking about imposing a limitation of speech. Privacy regulation is going to make product and service curation less efficient. I'll admit it sort of freaks me out when I watch a video on YouTube, let's say about pickup bed campers, and then I go and I'm reading USA Today on my phone, and there's an advertisement from you name it for pickup bed campers, right? Obviously, my YouTube watching is being passed to USA channels so that they can render for me the types of products that I've been investigating on YouTube. It is helpful. By and large, I fear that if they couldn't pass that information along, I'd wind up seeing more advertisements in my USA Today feed, because they wouldn't be as efficient at getting me to buy things, and therefore, the companies would still have to make their revenue. But it is sort of creepy, if you will. In some cases, regulation to increase competition might do so in general across the board, but it might actually decrease competition in certain products. Case in point, I buy a lot of electronic parts through Amazon, and when I'm looking for a cable or I'm looking for an add-in card or something, many times I'll go with Amazon's sort of in-house Amazon Basics line. I know they can almost always count on them being dependable. They're not necessarily the cheapest. They're not necessarily the best or the fastest parts, but they're nice basic parts, as the name describes them. The issue is that for some product lines that I buy, they're the only game in town. I think sometimes Amazon actually provides products or services that other competitors or third parties that sell through Amazon's website do not provide. So if we told Amazon all of a sudden, okay, you have to choose, are you going to be a marketplace or are you going to be a participant in your marketplace, one or the other, and they chose to host the marketplace, it might cut back on the number of products that would be available for me to purchase. And then finally, if we impose some sort of honesty regulation on the advertisements, clicks and views and so forth, right now, I don't know that most of those big tech networks actually have mechanisms in place to actually monitor that information. So they're going to have additional infrastructure. We're going to have additional overhead associated with doing the monitoring of all that information. That's above and beyond the monitoring of the monitoring, if you will, that you would see from a government agency that was responsible for it. So, in summary, when somebody starts talking about regulating big tech, which type of regulation are they talking about? What's the potential impact going to be? What's the pros versus the cons? This has hopefully given you enough background information so that you can better understand the arguments that are being made and the articles that you'll see continuing, I imagine, to be published in the media going forth. I hope that you found this discussion helpful, and I hope everybody has a good understanding now of what the sort of different aspects of big tech regulation are. Take care.